Before the ashes of Londinium blackened the sky, before the screams of the Roman Ninth Legion echoed through the forests, and long before her name became the synonym for vengeance, Boudicca was simply a child of the earth. History remembers her as the terrifying warrior queen, draped in a tartan cloak and wielding a heavy iron sword from the platform of a war chariot. But to understand the woman who would one day shake the foundations of the Roman Empire, one must first look to the misty, marshy plains of East Anglia. One must look to the herd. Born into the royal lineage of the Iceni tribe, Boudicca's inheritance was not one of marble palaces, manicured gardens, or the stifling geometric order that defined the Mediterranean world. Her kingdom was a sprawling, untamed canvas of dense oak woodlands, silver-threaded rivers, and vast wind-swept pastures. Her classroom was the great outdoors, and her earliest companions were the massive, lowing beasts that formed the pulsing heart of Celtic society. The great outdoors, a classroom without walls. In the Iron Age, childhood was not a sheltered prelude to life, it was an immediate immersion into it. From the moment she could walk, Boudicca was thrust into the embrace of the natural world. The Iceni people did not seek to conquer nature, they lived in a rhythmic, symbiotic dance with it. Growing up, Boudicca's feet knew the intimate textures of the earth, the squelch of the fenland mud, the sharp prick of winter frost on the morning grass, and the soft, dry dust of high summer. She learned to read the sky like a scroll, knowing instinctively when the bruised purple clouds promised a violent tempest and when the shifting of the wind heralded the arrival of the autumn chill. She learned the secrets of the forest, which mushrooms brought visions, which berries brought death, and which herbs, when crushed beneath a stone, could staunch the flow of blood from a wound. This outdoor existence forged an incredible physical resilience. Unlike the cloistered, pale-skinned daughters of Roman patricians who were kept indoors spinning wool, young Celtic women of noble birth ran wild. They swam in the freezing, fast-flowing rivers to harden their bodies. They climbed ancient oaks to spot approaching storm fronts or rival hunting parties. The biting winds that swept off the North Sea did not make them cower. It ruddied their cheeks and thickened their skin. Boudicca grew up tall, fiercely strong, and intimately connected to the land she would later bleed to defend. The living currency, the heart of Celtic culture. Yet the true center of Boudicca's early universe was not just the forest or the sky, it was the cattle. To the Iceni, as to all Celtic tribes, cattle were the absolute measure of a family's wealth, power, and prestige. In a world without minted coins, though the Iceni would later mint their own, cattle were the living currency. A man's status was counted by the number of horns in his pasture. Kings and queens were those who could boast herds that blackened the hillsides. Cattle provided everything necessary for survival: rich milk that was churned into butter and cheese, thick hides for clothing and shields, bone for tools, and on feast days, the meat that fed the roaring crowds in the great thatched roundhouses. As a high-born daughter, Boudicca was a child of the herd. She did not merely watch the cattle from afar, she lived among them. She grew accustomed to the rich, earthy smell of manure and damp hide. She learned to recognize the individual calls of the calves and the aggressive posturing of the massive breeding bulls. These were not the docile dairy cows of the modern era. Iron Age cattle were fierce, semi-wild creatures with sweeping, dangerous horns. To walk among them required confidence, a steady voice, and an utter lack of fear, traits that the young Boudicca absorbed into her very marrow. The art of the herd and the raid. Herding in the Iron Age was not a passive chore. It was an active, highly skilled, and often dangerous endeavor. The pastures were not fenced. The herds roamed vast tracts of communal land, requiring constant vigilance. Wolves still prowled the deep woods of Britannia, and the herdsmen and women had to be ready to drive off predators with spears and shouting. Moreover, the cattle were the focal point of the tribe's martial culture. The cattle raid was a deeply ingrained Celtic tradition, a rite of passage and a deadly serious game played between rival clans and neighboring tribes. Stealing a neighbor's cattle was not considered a petty crime. It was a demonstration of tactical brilliance, stealth, and bravery. Defending the herd was a matter of life, death, and absolute honor. Boudicca would have grown up steeped in the tales of legendary cattle raids, sung by the bards around the roaring hearth fires. She would have watched the young warriors of the Iceni returning from the borders, their faces painted with woad, driving stolen, lowing beasts before them in triumph. As she grew older, her responsibilities in the pasture would have merged with martial training. To protect the herd, she learned to ride. The rider and the land. The bond between the Celts, their cattle, and their horses was an unholy trinity of power. Boudicca learned to ride bareback, her hands twisted into the coarse mane of a hardy British pony, feeling the immense rippling power of the animal beneath her. She learned to guide the horse with the pressure of her knees, leaving her hands free to wield a javelin or a herding staff. Running with the hounds, riding the perimeter of the vast herds, and shouting into the wind, her voice grew strong enough to carry across a battlefield. The patience required to track a lost calf through a dense thicket translated seamlessly into the tactical patience required to track an enemy. The bravery needed to stand down a charging half-wild bull prepared her to face the disciplined shields of the Roman infantry. The landscape and the livestock were not just her environment, they were her spiritual foundation. The Druids taught her that the divine spirit flowed through the rivers, whispered in the oak groves, and breathed in the massive chests of the cattle. Her gods were gods of nature, of blood, and of the soil. By the time Boudicca reached adulthood, the wild outdoor life of a child of the herd had molded her into something formidable. She was not a fragile princess waiting for rescue. She was a woman who understood the raw, brutal, and beautiful realities of life and death. She knew how to nurture life, and she knew how to slaughter. She knew the value of what her people possessed, and she knew the fierce territorial instinct required to protect it. When the Romans eventually arrived, bringing their stone walls, their straight roads, and their ledgers of taxation, they looked at the wild, cattle-herding Celts and saw only barbarians. They failed to understand the strength of a people whose roots were driven so deeply into the earth. They failed to realize that when they scourged the queen of the Iceni and threatened her daughters, they were not just angering a woman, they were awakening the wrath of the land itself. They were provoking a child of the herd raised in the wind and the mud, who had learned her earliest lessons in warfare and survival from the sweeping horns of the great beasts beneath the vast, unbroken skies of ancient Britain.